Welcome to the Macmillan Report. I'm Marilyn Wilkes, your host, and our guest is Nuno Monteiro, Assistant Professor of Political Science at Yale University. Professor Monteiro's main research interests are in international relations theory and security studies. Today we'll talk with him about his forthcoming book that addresses 3 questions related to the topic of unipolarity. Is it peaceful? Is it durable? And how does it impact deterrence? Welcome, Professor Monteiro.
Thank you. Pleasure to be here.
Let's begin with a definition of unipolarity. What is it?
So unipolarity is a world system in which there's only one great power. So it's different from other world systems in that in the past we've only had systems with 2 great powers, say during the Cold War, in which you had the US and the Soviet Union, or before the Cold War more than 2, 3, 4, 5 great powers in Europe, the US rising in the early 20th century. And since the end of the Cold War, in my thinking, there's only one great power, because the US has far more power than any other state. Of course, this is mostly a definitional question, depends how you define a great power.
Sure.
And most people will define a great power as a state that's able to defend itself from any other state, from even the most powerful state in the system. I think that's not the most useful way of looking at it, because if you look at it that way, you get a world in which today there's 7, 8, 9 great powers. Arguably today, any state that has nuclear weapons can defend itself, and so you'd end up saying that North Korea is a great power, the same way that the US is a great power. I look at it from the perspective of how much power states can project. And the US's ability to project power in a global scale is much greater than any other states. So I think the US is the sole great power we have today, and the unipolar system is an international system with one great power.
Okay, very good. How did you come to write the book? What was your inspiration?
I started in graduate school. So I did my PhD at the University of Chicago, and I was working on international security topics, looking for a dissertation topic. And I was struck by 2 things. One, well, first of all, for me it was the most important topic I could think of, in the sense that unipolarity is the way the world works today. So it's the way the international system works today. It's, if you want, the background condition on which states make their decisions. And looking at what had been written on the topic, a great deal has been written on the topic. I'm by no means the first one to touch it. I was dissatisfied with how the literature just focused on great power interactions. And so basically the summary of the literature I could find was, well, we had 2 great powers during the Cold War. One is gone, the Soviet Union, therefore there's only one. Therefore, it's peaceful. There can't be conflict because there's only one. And of course this is right. It's also, I believe, quite trivial. And so I started to look into interactions between the one great power we have, the United States, and other states. And the second point that got me very interested in this was that since the typical view that you get published on the topic is that unipolarity is indeed peaceful, I was struck by the fact that the US has been involved in a great deal of war since the end of the Cold War. So the US, in the first 200 years of existence, in which it was one among several great powers, was at war for 35 years. In the last 20 years since the end of the Cold War, it has been at war for 12, so more than half. And it struck me that there was a lot of room for improving our understanding of the dynamics that generate conflict in worlds in which there's no other great power.
How did you do the research for your book?
I'm still doing it. It's mostly research on the theoretical aspects of it. So first of all, because I don't believe we have empirical evidence to prove a theory right or wrong. We only have 20 years of unipolarity. We haven't had any system like this before. We had great hegemonic powers in the past, like Rome, Imperial Rome, but they worked in ways that were very different. We didn't have a state system. So they had an imperial dimension that we don't have today. And so it's a rather unique situation, and the empirical evidence we have is scant. We have 20 years of evidence. I don't think with that you can prove any theory right or wrong. And so I thought the burden was on the theoretical development. And sometimes people tell me, well, if you can't prove the theory right or wrong, so why is it that you're devoting yourself to the topic? And I'd go back and say, this is the most important topic I can see today in international affairs. And so I started by looking at the theories that exist out there that could help us deal with this system that we have today, with figuring out how the world works with only one great power. And I didn't find much about interactions between that great power and other states. So I started to explore that, and also with a great deal of attention to the question of nuclear proliferation, because I think that nuclear weapons make a great deal of difference in terms of states being able to defend themselves without necessarily acquiring the same power, say, the US has.
Right.
So states today can sort of defend themselves in a relatively cheaper way by acquiring a nuclear arsenal without developing all the conventional power that the US has. So I started to look at, in terms of the question of peace, which was the first one I tried to address, how different the world is today in terms of smaller powers not having a potential security sponsor.
Okay.
So it's a very different world from, say, the Cold War, in which if a state felt threatened by the US, it could very likely find a sponsor in the Soviet Union,
right.
a patron, an alliance, a supporter. These days, that option is not there. And so by definition, they can't, since there's only one great power, they can't find another great power to sort of prevent an attack or a threat from this great power. And therefore, I think that there's a great incentive for them to acquire the capabilities, the military capabilities, namely nuclear weapons, that would guarantee their security and survival.
Okay. And why is it important to look at unipolarity, especially in terms of the three questions you put forth?
So the topic is important, I think, because not only it's the way the world works today, it will be the way the world will work as far as the eye can see. So we will live in a unipolar world probably for my lifetime, at least for 3-4 decades. Hopefully my lifetime is longer, but at least for 3-4 decades more. And so it's imperative that those of us who study international politics actually devote themselves to studying the dynamics that will take place in these next few decades. Many people today think that the US is in decline. You have successive waves of what I call declinist literature. In the 80s, there was the fear of Japan rising. Today, there's the idea that China will rise and take over. And so I think that I'm recalled of Niels Bohr, the prominent physicist, saying that prediction is a very difficult business, particularly about the future. I can't really predict whether China is going to rise or not, but I think whether China rises economically will not necessarily lead to China rising militarily. It depends on how we deal with them. So I think it's important because we may, despite the rise of states that are growing faster, because they are at a sort of earlier stage in their development, like China, India, Brazil, perhaps Russia will recover, who knows. Despite that, we will still have a long period in which we will live. Now, in terms of the three questions I asked, and you just asked me back, I think those are peace and durability are the most important questions you can ask. So if you believe that the system is peaceful, you want the system to be durable. If you believe the system is not peaceful, you don't want the system to be durable. So they're interrelated, and the answer to those two questions depends the amount of conflict and the costs and benefits that actually being a unipolar power, being the #1 power in the world by a very great difference like the US is today, the benefits and the costs of that. So whether in fact it's a good thing that the US is #1, and how much conflict can we expect as a result of that situation. And then I look at the smaller question of deterrence, narrower question of deterrence, because deterrence is a literature that emerged in the Cold War, and it's a technical term, but basically means how do states get to go to war? So if there is a crisis between two states, what has to happen for that crisis to actually result in military conflict? And so it's sort of the, as we call it, the micro foundations for answering the other two questions. It's sort of the micro answer for the other two questions. That's why I look at that.
Okay. And what are some of the conclusions you reach in your book?
So, first conclusion, which is about the first question, is that unipolarity is not peaceful. So I don't necessarily disagree with the conventional wisdom that it is peaceful in what concerns conflict about great powers, because of course there's only one, so by definition it's going to be peaceful. I do disagree, however, in that it is peaceful overall, because I think the effect of a unipolar structure of the international system on the interactions between the great power, the US, and minor powers, may result in a level of conflict that will compensate in a negative way that absence of great power war. Now, it's very difficult to give more precise answers in terms of how many casualties can you expect, how big will those conflicts go. The war is very unpredictable, so once you get into conflict, I bracket that question. But it's likely that we will have significant levels of conflict. The other aspect, the other question, is the question of durability, which is a question on which there is great debate. Will it be durable? Will the U.S. be forever the only great power? Will it be the only great power only for a while? Is it an age and then China or India or whoever it is takes over? Or is it actually a moment that's already finishing because of these days the financial crisis? There's always a temptation of sort of finding the news of the day and turning them into an argument for U.S. decline. I think that question has two answers, and the literature focuses on the first. The people tend to look at economic growth. And of course, since the U.S. is not the most populous country in the world, as other countries catch up in terms of economic development, their economy will be larger. And it's very likely that the U.S. will not be the largest economy in the world 3, 4, 5, several decades ahead. But I think the literature misses the second step, which is, well, will that economic power, rising economic power, that other country necessarily convert that economic power into military power and compete with the U.S. and try to, for instance, deny the U.S. The current command it has over globally air, sea, space. The U.S. currently has control of what we call the commons. Everything that's not another state is controlled by the U.S. And it has around 1,000 military installations abroad. Would the rising China try to revert that situation? And I think that the answer to that is it depends, as the answer to many questions is, depends on the actions of the U.S. It depends, it's very much in the U.S.'s own hands to have a policy of accommodation and reconciliation that enables a rising power to actually feel satisfied with the system, to extract from the system the benefits it feels it is entitled to as a result of its rising power, or whether the U.S. will try to contain a rising power and therefore increase its dissatisfaction with the way the system works, and as a result leave it to actually convert its latent power, economic power, into military power and try to compete with the U.S. So I think that depends very much on how the U.S. will behave in the next few decades.
Okay, final question, and you've touched on it a little bit, but how does your theory of unipolarity differ from conventional wisdom today?
3 points. First, I would say I try to argue that, as I said, unipolarity will be the way the world will work for a long time, whereas I think the consensus today, not the consensus, but the growing trend in the literature is to find reasons for U.S. decline, be it the financial crisis that somehow will affect the U.S. more than it affects other countries, be it military overextension, the fact that we're fighting a number of conflicts all over the world, true conflicts, and that we are overextended, those conflicts are not going particularly well, at least Afghanistan, and our military budgets and all of that are overstretched. So a very old and significant argument by Paul Kennedy, my colleague here, that says, great powers tend to overextend and therefore decline. So the consensus is on the growing consensus is on that position. I would say that that's not necessarily the case. That you could see the same preoccupation with the rising Soviet Union in the 50s and 60s. You could see the same preoccupation with the rising of Japan in the 80s. Huge literature saying we're doomed, they're going to overtake us in 5 years. Alas, they didn't grow in the 90s or in the past decade, very little growth. So that question, I think, I'm more inclined to say we will have unipolarity for a longer time than most people believe. And I would also differ on the question of peace, as I said, not because people are wrong, but because they're not looking at where I think they should look at, which is the, say, dynamics between the U.S. and countries like Iran or Korea. Arguably, those will be smaller conflicts than a world war would be, or a war with Russia, World War III would be, Soviet Russia. But they can still be important conflicts, and those are mechanisms for conflict that are directly derived from the fact that the world is unipolar. So unipolarity per se doesn't cause any war, but it creates the background conditions that facilitate, that promote certain mechanisms that can lead to war. And it's to those mechanisms that I devote my attention. In terms of the durability question, the last one and perhaps the most important, I think my take differs in that I separate the economic growth aspect of it from the military growth. And if perhaps we can look at the economic growth aspect of it in terms of other powers rising and eventually overtaking the US in terms of economic size, power, I think that's a separate question from the military power question. And I try to differentiate between both and argue that in a nuclear age, a state can guarantee its security and survival by acquiring nuclear weapons without necessarily matching the US power, and that in fact, if once it has acquired nuclear weapons, it tries to continue to acquire power to the point at which it competes with the US, it's actually taking actions that are detrimental to its survival and security because of the presence of nuclear weapons. So I think those are the main differences.
I see. Thank you very much for being here with us today and sharing some of your
pleasure.
research. For more information about Professor Monteiro and his work, please visit our website at yale.edu/Macmillan Report. Be sure to join us again for another episode of the Macmillan Report, made possible through funding from the Whitney and Betty Macmillan Center for International and Area Studies at Yale.